The apartment was small, almost suffocating in its neatness, tucked away on the top floor of a dull concrete building that overlooked a lightless alley where even cats refused to linger. When Anton moved in, the place had seemed harmless, modest, nearly forgettable: one room, a compact kitchenette, a pale gray sofa pushed too close to a low table, and a window that stared across at a crumbling brick wall. He hadn't been looking for charm or history, only for stillness, the kind that didn't ask questions or leave marks when he passed through. And for the first week, the stillness obeyed, clinging to the walls like dust. The nights were quiet, too quiet perhaps, but not unusually so for a man who'd long stopped expecting anything more from sleep than the steady rhythm of blackout and return. He would set the kettle on the stove, listen to it hum its way to a boil, sit in silence while the tea cooled, and eventually drift off on the couch, the television left on mute as a dim source of motion. But it was on the 8th night that something shifted. Not violently, not suddenly, but just enough to be noticed. The painting on the wall, a print of some washed-out landscape he'd barely glanced at, was no longer centered above the sofa. It had moved left, maybe 2-3 inches. He frowned, but not in fear. He'd likely brushed against it during the day without remembering. Still, he reached up and nudged it back, aligning it once more with the middle seam of the cushions. That night, he lay awake longer than usual, listening to the creak of the pipes and the ticking of something metallic behind the walls, a ticking that didn't belong to any clock he owned. The next evening, the rug had shifted. It no longer sat flush with the legs of the table. It had twisted clockwise, just enough to make the right corner curl upward. The plant by the window, a fake monstera he'd picked up for a sense of color, stood a little closer to the glass, as if it had leaned into the dusk. Again, he corrected them, telling himself it was nothing, only restlessness, his own hands moving things while distracted. Perhaps he walked differently through the room than he thought. Perhaps. By the 11th night, the floor tiles no longer lined up. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, the dull glow from the window casting uneven shadows. But when he stood over them, barefoot and still, he could see it plainly: the seams between the tiles no longer formed a straight line. One tile, in the corner near the kitchenette, had clearly rotated slightly, breaking the pattern. It was absurd, they were fixed, part of the floor, cemented in place. Yet the gap between two tiles now formed a subtle diagonal, like a skewed grid. He didn't mention it to anyone. He hadn't spoken to anyone in weeks, in truth. There were no friends in this part of the city, no job yet to keep him moving through familiar motions. The apartment was the only witness to his hours. He began to keep notes, marking the changes in a spiral-bound notebook with mechanical precision. Day 12, plant moved 4.5 centimeters right. Day 13, mirror slightly convex, unsure if always so. Day 14, window appears 1.2 centimeters taller, confirm later. The changes became a routine of their own, a liturgy of the shifting mundane. He would wake up, inspect the room, compare it to memory, to the notes, and adjust whatever had strayed from its place. But the adjustments stopped working. The picture above the sofa refused to stay centered, He would wake to find it slanted, lower than before, as if sinking toward the floor. The rug now buckled at strange angles, never in the same direction twice. The air itself began to feel angled, bent inwards at the corners, like a photograph that had curled from years of hidden heat. The proportions of the room, once unremarkable, began to feel off. The ceiling hovered too close some nights, and others, it receded, giving the light fixture too much space, stretching the shadows across the walls until they bled into the corners like spilled ink. And yet, none of it was loud. The horror of it was in its quiet. No footsteps, no whispers, no malevolent gestures. Only shifts. Only details. The kind that made him question whether anything had ever been real, or whether the apartment had simply been pretending, waiting for him to notice. When he tried to take pictures, the room looked exactly as it should. The images on his phone showed no distortions, no skewed patterns, no misaligned objects. But when he compared the images to what he saw, to what he felt, the difference was unmistakable. As if the apartment knew when it was being watched, and held still just long enough to fool the eye. He stopped taking notes. The pages felt useless now, documenting a reality that only existed when he didn't look directly at it. But even as he gave up trying to correct the changes, he couldn't stop noticing them. The light from the hallway no longer reached past the threshold. The doorknob was subtly colder every evening. The sounds, the ones behind the walls, grew slower, deeper, like breath drawn too long and never quite released. There were no voices, but he often found himself responding to something unspoken, pausing mid-step as though he'd heard his name called in the stillness. He began to sleep less, not out of fear, but out of reluctance. The space behind his eyes, when he closed them, seemed wider than before. And every morning, when he blinked awake, it was with the dread of discovering what had changed this time, and whether the version of the room he opened his eyes to would still resemble the one he had fallen asleep in. By the 17th night, he couldn't remember if the door had always opened inward. On the 18th morning, the light didn't arrive. The sky outside remained locked in a pre-dawn gray, thick and depthless, as though the sun had forgotten this particular stretch of the world. Anton stood by the window, unsure whether he was looking out or into something that only wore the illusion of outside. The brick wall beyond, usually dappled with shadow, appeared flatter now, as if someone had painted it there in place of the real one, and when he pressed his palm against the glass, there was no temperature, no trace of cold or warmth, only the dull, resistant pressure of a barrier that no longer pretended to breathe. That day, he didn't eat. He couldn't recall if he had eaten the day before. The kitchen remained in its proper shape, or so he thought, though the cupboards no longer opened with the same gentle resistance, but instead hung slightly ajar, as if they'd grown tired of closing. The kettle whined without heat when he lifted it. The tap produced water that felt the right temperature but made no sound when it struck the steel of the sink. He let it run, silently, for hours, just to see if it would eventually admit to itself. When night came, it was abrupt. There was no transition, no soft descent into shadows. One moment he stood in the center of the room, adjusting the blanket on the sofa that now sagged in its middle like it had been sat on for years by something too heavy to leave a mark, and the next moment, darkness draped the space like a velvet curtain. The lamp, when clicked, produced no light, only the muted sensation of movement, as if something behind the walls had turned its head in sync with the switch. The bulb remained cold to the touch. He lit a candle and watched the flame struggle to find shape, bending slightly left regardless of where he stood.